Tonight we're going to hear from 6 speakers discussing subjects that are going to adversely impact on our daily lives in the future. I will introduce each speaker separately so that you can have a yarn and see what they look like. Each speaker has, and hopefully will speak for no more than 10 minutes, a little less if they've done the right thing. And following the last speaker, there's going to be a question and answer session. And each of you will have the opportunity to ask questions of the panel who will be seated up here on the stage at that time. It is our intention to conclude the meeting at 9:30, and I hope that we will do that. I will do my best to make sure we do finish by 9:30. I'd now like to call upon Mr. Colin Latcham, our very energetic chairman for Western Suburbs Alliance, who has some words of welcome for you. Would you please welcome Mr. Latcham? While he's walking up here, I'll just read a few lines I have about Mr. Latcham. Mr. Latcham was formerly the head of the Teacher Learning Group at Curtin University and president of the Open and Distance Learning Association of Australasia. Since retiring, he has been a visiting professor in various Asian and European universities and has written a number of books on open and distance education. Closer to home, you may know him as the author of many letters to the Post on the Western Suburbs planning and amalgamation issues. Mr. Latcham is the chairman of the Western Suburbs Alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Colin Latcham.
Thank you very much, Richard. And as chairman of the Western Suburbs Alliance, I'm very pleased to welcome you all here for tonight's forum. It's gratifying to see so many of you giving up time to come and join us in this event. WSA was formed by members of various community groups in Claremont, Cottesloe, Mosman Park, Peppermint Grove, Nedlands and Subiaco. And its launch was marked by the publication of a letter in the Post newspaper of July the 1st, 2012, signed by 38 mayors, former mayors, councillors and other high-profile citizens, and expressing concern about the new state planning laws which give dictatorial powers to the Minister for Planning. Since that time, our membership and the donations have grown dramatically, and we've also held a very successful public forum in Cottesloe. It's interesting to point out that we've also received supportive calls from across the metropolitan area and beyond. Now, as you'll hear tonight, we're faced with forcible amalgamation of our councils. This is all part of the Barnett government's attempt to centralise power and control and erode our democratic rights. You'll be hearing about the Robson report, but I'll just give you a very brief background. It recommends reducing the number of councils in metropolitan Perth to 12 or 16. It recommends compulsory voting at council elections and the permitting of party political nominations. Premier Barnett has made it clear from the start that he wants amalgamation and says that if necessary, amalgamation will be enforced by Act of Parliament. He's deliberately delaying any decision on this matter until after the March 9 election. When it comes to planning matters, the 2010 Approvals and Related Reforms No. 4 Planning Act represents the biggest change in the state's planning laws since 1928. Many of you around Subiaco will know about these development assessment panels, or DAPs. They make decisions on all developments over $7 million, or between $3 and $7 million at the discretion of the applicant. In other words, if the developers want a smaller development to be considered by the DAPs, that's the way it goes. These DAPs are made up of 3 technical specialist members, mostly private consultants, and 2 council members. The developers have right of appeal the councils are denied this right. And the Planning Minister and newly formed Metropolitan Regional Redevelopment Authority can rezone any part of the metropolitan region, taking planning and development controls away from our local councils and even the WA Planning Commission. Now you'll hear a lot more about these iniquitous amalgamation and planning issues from our speakers tonight. I'd just like to end by pointing out that WSA is not against change, nor is it against development, nor is it against government reorganisation per se. What it is against is the ruination of our built and natural environment by developments that are totally out of character with our lifestyle and aspirations. The deliberate disempowerment and marginalising of our councils and our communities, and enforced local government reorganisation without any strong evidence of the benefits and cost benefits or any chance to vote on amalgamation. Thank you very much for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker for the evening is Her Worship the Mayor of Subiaco, Mrs Heather Henderson. Mrs Henderson was first elected to the Subiaco Council in May 1990 and completed a 13-year term in 2002. 3 years later, in May 2005, Mrs Henderson was elected Mayor of the City of Subiaco. Mrs Henderson is a State Councillor on the Western Australian Local Government Association and the Vice Chair of the Western Australian Local Government Women's Association. Her civic associations are many, and she is currently patron of the Subiaco RSL sub-branch, the Subiaco Small Ball Rifle Club, the Pelican Point Sea Scouts, and vice patron of the Subiaco Football Club, an active foundation. Would you please welcome Her Worship the Mayor, Mrs Heather Henderson.
The recently release of the final report from the Metropolitan Local Government Review Panel foreshadows the most significant changes that we have seen in the history of local government in Western Australia. One of the recommendations in this report, which poses a real and immediate threat to our communities, is the amalgamation of the 7 Western Suburbs local governments. The Western Suburbs have undoubtedly been targeted for amalgamations since the state government began its reform agenda about 4 years ago. In 2009, the state government asked local governments to participate in voluntary amalgamations. The City of Subiaco and Nedlands were the only local governments in the metropolitan area who responded. We formed a 3-way partnership with the state government by creating a regional transition group. The group went through the state government's process of developing a feasibility study, which was designed to look at costs and benefits of a merger between the City of Subiaco and Nedlands. When the feasibility study was complete, we took it to our communities for comment. Despite the projected annual savings of around 3 to 4 million annually, the City of Subiaco community strongly rejected an amalgamation. The primary reasons for that rejection were that they wanted to retain the city's independence, their unique sense of identity, and their local democracy. Many of the arguments put forward in favour of a merger, such as achieving economies of scale, increasing strategic capacity and cost savings, were not seen as a convincing enough argument to support a merger, and the community felt the costs outweighed the benefit, and the risk of losing a vibrant, connected, inclusive community was too great a price to pay. The community had spoken loudly, and so to reflect the community's wishes, the Council unanimously voted against a merger in July 2011. But despite being part of what we believed was a voluntary process, this wasn't the end of it. We then found ourselves involuntary in the middle of a local government advisory board inquiry. It seemed that the voluntary process was not so voluntary after all. The City of Subiaco then defended its independence by blocking the advisory board's inquiry with the Supreme Court ruling. This was a great result for our community. Throughout the inquiry process, there were 2 unwavering constants: the community's passion and commitment to retaining an independent local government, and the distinct lack of contact from our partners in the reform process, the state government. The state government was not interested in talking to the city about its experience. It did not seek feedback in order to improve the local government reform process and learn from what had occurred. In fact, it did quite the opposite. It closed its shutters, shut up shop, and refused to engage with the city of Subiaco at all. I relate the story to what we now face with the state government's latest reform bid. The initial promises of working together to reach positive outcomes are all too familiar. Minister Castrelli has again assured us that he will be able to work with local governments to reach a positive reform outcomes. But what is the minister's measure of determining whether the outcomes are positive? Is it simply by predetermining that the implementation of the panel's recommendation will automatically result in positive outcomes? Or will he take a closer look to measure the benefits for the local communities? Local government is all about local communities. Therefore, local government reform must be centred on creating positive outcomes for those local communities. As such, the community must be involved in the decision-making to determine the desired outcomes and tell us if indeed change is needed at all. This is what local democracy is about. It is the cornerstone of local government, and that is why some of us are here tonight. So why not let the community decide? The state government should take a leaf out of local government's books if it wants to understand how effectively to engage with the community on the issue of reform. Smaller local governments have a proven track record of meaningful engagement with their communities. This is often evidenced by the level of involvement the community has in the key issues affecting the city. Larger local government bodies usually result in a decreased ability to keep in touch with communities at a local level. How is the state government going to ensure that the community's voice is heard and larger local governments will not dilute our highly valued local democracy? The city of Subiaco celebrates 116 years of history, during which time we've developed a strong sense of identity, uniqueness and community spirit. The state government, unlike the Subiaco community, believes that that sense of place and identity will not be threatened by local government reform. It will. We are now faced with similar circumstances to those of the 1970s, which saw the inspirational efforts of the late Tom Dador, who fought passionately to retain Subiaco's independence. Tom's commitment resulted in the introduction of the Dador Bill, which gives the community the power to decide on any council mergers or boundary changes via referendum. It is this critical piece of legislation that is now under threat. Ultimately, we are faced with a battle to protect our local democracy, a democracy that recognises and celebrates the importance of bringing together communities of interest to create a vibrant, connected and inclusive community. History shows that larger local government bodies result in a certain level of standardisation that erodes the unique connectedness and sense of identity. Where is the evidence that demonstrates a sense of place and local identity can be maintained in significantly larger local governments? The Robson report identifies that there is significant duplication, waste, fragmentation and variation in the capacity of local governments to cater for community needs. There is a wide spectrum of opinion as to whether bigger operations can reduce duplication, improve efficiencies and reduce lower costs for the residents. The panel also found that the current local government boundaries are illogical. Well, the submission responded to this particular point by saying the first and most important criteria for changes to local government boundaries is a deep and broad community support. Without that, the affected communities embracing the change, the newly created local government entity may struggle to emerge administratively and political systems and develop a coherent community of interest. Again, this reiterates the point that communities must be involved in the decision-making process, otherwise it's destined to fail. As Professor Dollery found in his work, The Western Suburbs Local Government, diversity in local government sector is extremely important, particularly when considering the implementation of uniform state government policies, such as forced amalgamation. Dollery maintains that a one-size-fits-all approach to local government reform, like statewide forced amalgamation programs, are not appropriate for all local authorities. In fact, he states that it's most unlikely that one of the solutions will work for all councils to meet a given policy objective, and that consideration will need to be given to individual circumstances of each council when determining any policy. So one can't help conclude that the reform agenda is really simply about amalgamations of local government, regardless of the circumstances. This view is perpetuated by the panel and the state's government lack of evidence to support the need for significant change. The panel makes it clear that the continuation of the existing arrangements is not in the best interest of the people of metropolitan Perth. It unanimously agrees that 30 councils in the metro area are too many and 12 larger councils would more likely to be successful. Meanwhile, the Premier contends that he continues to hold his view that 15 to 20 is his preference. In the panel's view, the projected population increase of 1 million people in the next 20 years is a catalyst for change. But the fact is, Perth has just experienced an increase in population of 1 million in the past 30 years, and it is the current local government structures that stepped up to this challenge to meet the community's needs. After this unprecedented growth, our local communities are as vibrant as ever, and Perth is considered the 9th most livable city in the world. As this debate unfolds, the continued uncertainty is hindering local government, its sector, its staff, elected members and our communities. At a recent meeting of key local government representative bodies, the Premier was quick to state that he would not engage in any discussion around local government reform. He stated that the focus for the state is on the forthcoming election and that he would be focusing on the reform after the election in May. This has been a long journey for local government. We've spent over 4 years responding to, participating in the reform process. To be left once again with no certainty on future process until after the election is completely unacceptable. There is no excuse for leaving local government in limbo. The Premier should state his government's policy and get a mandate for change at the next election. He is not willing to do this. I urge you to respond at the March elections to send a clear message to the state government that this is not on. Let's fight for our local democracy, our independence, our unique communities, and more importantly, our right to decide.
The second speaker is His Worship the Mayor of Netherlands, Mr. Max Hipkins. Mr. Hipkins is a qualified planner, engineer and architect with a practical experience in Australia and overseas. Most of his professional life he has worked as a development consultant in the private sector. In local government he has held the positions of Director of Planning at the cities of Netherlands and Perth. At Perth he worked on a master plan for the city which included the waterfront, Betty's Jetty. He is currently a Fellow of the Planning Institute of Australia and Mayor of Netherlands. Please welcome Mr. Hipkins.
Thanks, Richard. I was expecting a button to press for the slides. How are we going to work those? Should I raise my hand or something like that? Okay. Can we have the first one, please? That's more than the first one. Sorry. I was looking at the screen at the back. I thought it was going to be reflected up there. Perhaps before I start, I should say that over the last week or so there have been a number of emails that have been circulating by people who don't understand the concept of wearing different hats. They're asking, will I be speaking as a town planner or as a candidate in the state election or as Mayor for the City of Netherlands? What I'd like to do is to sidestep those issues and to say that my comments are personal, they're only my own. Right. The recently released final report of the Metropolitan Local Government Review, known as the Robson Report, has recommended the amalgamation of 7 Western Suburbs councils into one consolidated local government with a combined population of around 80,000 people. If this was to eventuate, it would result in the loss of identity of all communities involved. I would like to illustrate this by looking at just 2 of the affected cities or municipalities, Subiaco and Netherlands, which I know most about. Now, it would be possible to compare any other local governments within the Western Suburbs to the same effect. The locality of what is now the city of Subiaco was one of the earliest parts of the Western Suburbs to be settled. It was developed around the railway station and later along tram routes in Hay Street and Rockaby Road. Workers' cottages and even upmarket accommodation built in the 19th century is now widely recognised for its heritage values. And this produced a relatively dense settlement pattern. Higher density development has continued to this day and encouraged a high proportion of young adults in the demographic population mix. Now, this is reflected in the activities and services available within the city. The suburbs of Subiaco and Shenton Park have a rich tradition in supporting the performing arts and in sporting entertainment. Subiaco Oval is the home of WA football and a well-known landmark. Subiaco is also known for its markets and has one of the most successful traditional retail centres outside central Perth. The result is a strongly cohesive city, financially secure and fiercely independent. The city of Netherlands is quite different. Situated between the 2 railway stations and early settled areas of Claremont and Subiaco, stretching between the river and the ocean, it was one of the last parts of the Western Suburbs to be developed. Its open spaces attracted holidaymakers for sports and recreation, such as at Steve's Netherlands Park Hotel and the Netherlands Baths. When the area was opened up for urban settlement, advertisements proclaimed no pocket handkerchief blocks, close to parks, and based on the latest Canadian and English methods of picturesque designs. Much of the district was settled between the wars when Art Deco was the fashion. There are also examples of mock Tudor design reflecting fashionable English villages. The low-density settlement pattern contains much vegetation and attracts bird life. There are many parks with clubs that allow the City of Netherlands to not only offer football and cricket, but hockey, soccer, rugby, croquet, lawn bowls, gridiron, tennis, volleyball, futsal, golf, sailing, swimming and surf lifesaving. Most of Netherlands' sporting clubs have a high proportion of members living outside the city, mostly in other parts of the Western Suburbs. An extensive river shoreline, ocean beach and a high proportion of parklands have large maintenance costs and presented a challenge for the city with its limited commercial base. Divided by Stirling Highway and West Coast highways, the City of Netherlands comprises a series of distinct dormitory communities that value their family lifestyle, each with their own identity. From time to time, the city has explored merging with its neighbours, but has never convinced its potential partners, or even its own residents, of the advantages. happen if the cities of Subiaco and Netherlands were absorbed within a greater Western Suburbs Council? The first thing that would happen would be that political representation would be reduced. Netherlands, with 12 elected members with a population of around 22,000, currently has one elected member per 8,600 odd people. Subiaco, with 12 elected members and a population of around 19,000, currently has one elected member for about 1,500 people. A Greater Western Suburbs Council with 12 elected members for a population of 80,000 would have one elected member for each 6,600 people. Now, that's assuming that there are 12 elected members plus a mayor. If, as Robson has recommended, there's only 9, then you're looking at one elected member for about 9,000 people. Now, with the 12 elected members plus a mayor, that means approximately only 3 members for Subiaco and 3 for Netherlands. In both cases, political representation would decline by more than 75%. With such a heavy workload, councillors would have a full-time job looking after their constituents. And the recommendation by Robson is that they be paid accordingly, probably in excess of $100,000 each, which is a far cry from the small allowances that they receive now. This is the reality, and counter to the argument that amalgamation would do away with many elected members and result in considerable savings. Of course, the same argument applies with doing away with duplicated senior staff. Those who remain will demand increased pay for increased responsibilities and probably also need deputies to cope with their increased workload. The second thing that would happen with large amalgamated councils is that the new legal entity would attract party politics. The new council would have a considerable budget to spend and lucrative contracts to award. It would provide a good training ground for aspiring state and federal politicians. Because of the larger population and larger area to cover, no longer would individuals be able to afford to stand for positions on council. It would be only political parties who would have the funds to field candidates. Electors would be faced with only party candidates who could be expected to follow party lines, not what is in the best interest for the electorate and the maintenance of local identity. The third thing that would happen with wholesale amalgamations would be the stripping of local assets to pay for the restructure. The recent local government amalgamation in Queensland cost around $100 million. With the government of Western Australia having a large and increasing state debt, the obvious source of funds to pay for the amalgamations is local government. The city of Subiaco has reserve funds of almost $200 million, more than enough to pay for the merger. By comparison, the city of Netherlands has minimal cash reserves, but it has substantial land resources in its parks and gardens. The government-controlled Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority and Land Corp have targeted parks for development and sale, such as the Perth waterfront and at Point Perrin. Subiaco Oval has already been identified for downsizing and development of density housing and sale, similar to what is occurring at Claremont Oval. This is once the new Birdswood Stadium is up and operating. Netherlands could expect its parklands to be targeted. There is no doubt that local government would be stripped of its cash and its land assets in the transition to amalgamated local governments, a major threat to the local character and services. To complete the destruction of local identity, this will come about in the name of equity or alternatively with the ganging up of the majority of elected members against the minority to protect their own interests. In the name of equity, it is quite conceivable to imagine 9 of 12 councillors in the large Western Suburbs Council deciding Nedlands must give up its large lots to accommodate increased housing densities to alleviate zoning pressures elsewhere. It is also conceivable that a majority of councillors could decide that Subiaco is closest to central Perth, has a good rail connection, and already with its pattern of high density living, it should take a disproportionate amount of increased housing density. In the case of both Nedlands and Subiaco, the character and local identity would be irretrievably changed if these scenarios were to occur. With one large council for the western suburbs, it can be expected that local differences will largely be ironed out and most of the area will end up looking much the same, with higher density housing and fewer parklands. The threat to local identity from amalgamation of local governments is real and imminent if the present government is returned. Both major political parties have at one time or another advocated amalgamation. Only independent representation in Parliament, representing local interests first and foremost, can forestall the amalgamation and loss of local identity. The state election is on the 9th of March 2013. Make March 9 Independence Day. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is His Worship the Mayor of Mosman Park, Mr. Ron Norris. And it's like old homework, right? Mr. Norris is a qualified engineer for the past 40 years and has operated his own business as an insurance loss adjuster and risk management consultant. In the distant past, Ron and I spent many hours together in the City of Subiaco Council chambers when he was elected a councillor for the City of Subiaco in 1977. He served 2 terms, did not seek re-election, and moved to Mosman Park in 1983. In 1987, he was elected as a councillor in the town of Mosman Park until 2007, when he became the mayor. Mr. Ron Norris.
Thank you, Richard. For those of you who don't know, that's what the Robson report looks like. So if you happen to see it lost in any library, you most probably could rip it apart and bring us all a lot of pleasure. My contribution on the local government reform issue for tonight is to talk about the flawed process that we've been through in local government reform and to bring to your attention the order of magnitude of the money that's been wasted by the state government in this process since we started 3 years ago. We've had no guidance in the process. This has been a core problem for all local governments. The only response we've had from the state government has been bullying threats along the lines of, agree to amalgamate or we'll do it for you. And yet no evidence has been provided to demonstrate that this massive dislocation of local government is desired by ratepayers or that it will deliver any tangible benefit. Apart from Peppermint Grove, I'm not aware of one council which is opposed to the so-called reform process. All of us, including Peppermint Grove, willingly participated in the regional transition grouping process called the RTG process, not surprisingly, which Minister Castrilli initiated in February 2009. Similarly, we all made submissions to the Robson panel 12 months ago. Unfortunately, as far as the western suburbs were concerned, Mr. Robson wasn't listening. The Robson panel has now given the government its final report, and I'll come back to the content of that report later. But the government now expects us to make another submission on this report. To add insult to injury, they won't consider our submissions until after the state election in March. And we now learn that these submissions, unlike those that we made earlier, will not be published. We're told that publishing comments may prevent people from providing their true opinions. Of course. It also means that no one, except the government, will ever know what anyone thinks about the 30 Robson recommendations. I mentioned in passing that the only reason we have Robson's final report before us now is because the Premier was embarrassed into releasing it at the last WSA forum held in Cottesloe. Robson submitted his final report to the government in July, and I think the Minister was happily sitting on it, hoping we'd all forgotten about it. I suspect we would not have seen it until after the March election if the WSA forum hadn't occurred. It is unfortunate but not surprising that the government has refused to go to the election with a declared platform on amalgamations. The Local Government Association, WELGA, has tried to discuss aspects of the Robson report with the Premier, but he has refused unequivocally to meet. He will not discuss the reform agenda or local government issues with WELGA. Is this acceptable for an open and democratic society? As far as the cost of the exercise is concerned, in May this year, Minister Castrilli advised Parliament that since February 2009, the government has spent over $20 million on the local government reform process. Since then, Robson has completed his, and I say in inverted commas, independent review and reported to the government. I have to assume that this would have added another couple of $1 million to the bill. If the submissions from the councils on the final report are now to be considered by the local government department, if that ever occurs, that will bring us up to about $25 million. And if you now consider what the individual local authorities have spent responding first to the RTG process and then to Robson, draft and final, I suspect you could double that figure. What a monumental waste of time, money and resources. If the councils had been given some parameters such as target population, minimum rates turnover, or land area for us to aim at, we may have been able to achieve something. Instead, we were given nothing. In May 2009, when questioned specifically on this point, Minister Castrilli's answer was, "You're all smart people, you can work it out for yourselves." To this day, we still don't know what the government wants to achieve by way of local government reform. The RTG process, which involved all West Australian councils, was almost a total failure. Subiaco and Netherlands explored the possibility of an amalgamation, but ultimately backed away. Geraldton and Greenock have amalgamated, but they have wanted to do that for years. It did not require the RTG process for that to occur. And I just mentioned in passing, you may have seen the recent publicity that the rates in the Geraldton-Greenock Shire have increased 24% in the last year. The RTG process did not give the government what it desired in the metropolitan area, so the next step was the appointment of the distinguished and independent Robson panel. The members of the panel may be distinguished in their respective fields of academia, but I can assure you they were not appointed for their knowledge of local government. And the panel's terms of reference ensured that they were not going to be too independent either. One of the terms was that they should identify new local government boundaries and a resultant reduction in the overall number of local governments to meet the needs of the community. Exactly what the needs of the community means has never been defined. So even if the panel, in its independent, and I say independent review, determined that no change was needed, a reduction in the number of councils always had to be recommended by Robson. We are now expected to respond to the 30 recommendations in the final report, which is a completely pointless exercise. I say pointless because if the government is re-elected and it has the numbers, the amalgamations will be rammed through, in the words of the Premier, by Act of Parliament, if necessary, regardless of what the councils or the communities want. Conversely, if the government isn't re-elected or it doesn't have the numbers, no change will occur at all. Either way, we have the very high probability that our submissions will never be acted upon. Even more unnecessary waste to be borne by the taxpayer. A core problem with the Robson Review is that it fails to consider the word local is relevant to local government. They don't see local government as communities, they see councils as corporations, as though the only issue being considered by residents is the cost of providing the services we provide, and Robson posits that this can only be achieved by creating larger municipalities. Robson imagines that the only outcome desired by ratepayers is fiscal astringency, yet the vast number of ratepayers and residents place far more value on connectedness and in the sense of community which smaller councils offer. As an aside, you may be aware of the recent dismissal of Canning Council. It is interesting to note that most of the councils which have been dismissed in the last 20 years have been large councils, exactly what Mr. Robson has recommended. The efforts of the panel could be viewed favourably if they were based on fact, yet they have recommended amalgamations in the face of the empirical evidence available from the eastern states which points in precisely the opposite direction. The Minister claimed cost savings of 10 to 15% could be achieved by amalgamations, yet the evidence in the eastern states is that costs have increased by that margin. At least Robson had the honesty to not agree with the Minister. You should appreciate that the Robson Review had nothing to do with beneficial fiscal outcomes. The sole purpose of the review is to reduce or eliminate effective local representation and to increase centralised power for the government, principally in relation to planning matters. To illustrate, a councillor in Mosman Park represents about 1,500 residents. If the Robson amalgamations occur, each councillor will represent 10 times that number. How a councillor could be expected to represent this number of residents on a part-time basis and with no administrative support is a mystery to me. Clearly, it is not the intention of the government that they will. I don't think the government could care less who was elected to a council. It merely wants the appearance of local democracy. Robson's recommendation 20 is that councillors serve a maximum of 3 terms and mayors 2 terms. The government doesn't want anyone on a council with the experience, skills or time to oppose its development plans. Recommendation 12 is relevant to this point. It proposes that the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, known as the MRA, be given control of airports, hospitals and universities. Giving control of hospitals to the MRA would mean that a QE2 or a Fiona Stanley could pop up at the end of your street and there is nothing you can do about it. But the real objective of this recommendation 12 relates to universities. Mr. Robson was quoted at the start of his review process saying that one of the things he found frustrating about dealing with local government is at the University of WA he had to deal with 3 separate councils. So you would not be surprised to see a recommendation like that pop up which says that if this were adopted, universities would be allowed to do whatever they wished with their land. And again, councils and communities would have no say in the matter. Recommendation 28 is that the government provide the tools to cope with the transition to larger councils. It is not recommended that the government fund the cost of this transition. This would indicate that the government is not only intending to do away with effective local government, but you will be given the pleasure of paying for it. I've deliberately selected only a few of Robson's recommendations to comment on, those recommendations which I believe have a direct and immediate adverse effect on our communities. We are faced with a sleight of hand position. The government either is too arrogant to understand it is accountable for this wastage and duplicity, or it thinks we are too stupid to do anything about it. The Western Suburbs Alliance is to be commended for allowing us to come together in forums such as tonight so that community outrage can be ventilated and shared. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Mr. Ken Eastwood. Mr Eastwood is a Fellow and Life Member of CPA Australia, having held the positions of both WA State President and National President of CPA Australia. Having spent most of his professional life as an accountant in his own public practice, he has also owned and operated a group comprising 2 private acute surgical hospitals and 2 large private nursing homes. Before retiring in April 2000, Mr Eastwood acted as Chief Executive Officer for 2 large Perth law practices for 12 years. He was appointed a member of the General Division of the Order of Australia in 1994 in recognition of his contribution to the accounting profession and for his services to the community. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr Ken Eastwood.
Thank you, Richard. The Metropolitan Local Government Review conducted by the panel led by Professor Alan Robinson contains some 30 recommendations regarding the amalgamation of Metropolitan Perth's 30 local councils to either 12 super councils, and that's option A, or 16 super councils, option B. It's important to note that neither the Robson report nor the Minister for Local Government has suggested that any savings will follow from these recommendations or that there will be any reduction in our rates. The only person to claim this is the Premier himself. The only example of amalgamation we have in the recent voluntary amalgamation of Geraldton and Greenock, as you heard. In that instance, rather than enjoying a reduction of rates, the rates increased by a massive 24%. There are suggestions in some quarters that fewer councils will result in savings. In fact, Professor Robson doesn't claim that or provide any evidence of cost savings. The report's recommendations 16 to 20 and recommendation 23 refer to the appointment of CEOs, mayors and councillors for the new structure and the setting of fees for councillors. Looking at the western suburbs, it might be assumed that what is proposed that is amalgamating 7 councils will save the salaries of 7 CEOs, each currently earning approximately $260,000 per annum, and reduce the number of councillors by around 70. Good possibility to save some money, you would think. The total saving in CEO salaries might be about $1.8 million a year, but what costs are we going to pick up along the way? Well, for a start, some or all of these CEOs will need to receive redundancy payments, as presumably will other senior staff if efficiencies are to be achieved. But then we'll have a much larger council of 80,000 ratepayers to service, so a higher calibre of CEO and support staff will be needed. The CEO alone for this much larger enterprise, including his deputies and a higher level of support staff, might well attract salaries and allowances in total around $500,000 per annum. The salaries of the deputies and support staff will need to be commensurately higher. Fees and allowances for elected members will be set by the Salaries and Allowances Tribunal. Based on Eastern States models, the 9 councillors elected to this new super council will have to be paid approximately $150,000 a year, in my opinion. They were in fact paid $120,000 a year 3 years ago when this all happened on the East Coast. So already we're up to nearly $2 million per annum to offset the saving of $1.8 million for dispensing with 7 CEOs. And we haven't yet accounted for the costs of housing this bigger council with all its additional staff, nor joining the assets, nor dealing with the individual council liabilities. Remember, under the current system, our councillors virtually work for their communities for no reward at all, save for reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses. Now, under the proposed regime, each councillor will have to represent 9,000 plus ratepayers, not the current 1,500. This can no longer be seen as a local government. Perhaps a new description is also in the offering. Paying these elected representatives, the mayor and councillor, substantial fees introduces a whole new concept of experience expenditure in local government. These services, as I said, were previously provided gratis by the councillors and the ratepayers. The introduction of these new costs must impact on the cost structure of local government for all West Australians in a manner which is unacceptable to us all. The Robson report recommends that party politics be introduced into the system along with compulsory voting. Don't we have enough hassles managing our party politicians as it is, without introducing a third tier of party politics? Do we need and can we afford a third tier of government in Western Australia? Attempts to introduce a third level of government in Western Australian politics would, in my view, be soundly rejected by the West Australian community. That is, if they are allowed to vote on the issue, which of course Premier Barnett says they won't be, because he said he will force this through by Act of Parliament. Bringing party politics into local government will reduce the standing of our councils, marginalise our communities, and do nothing to enhance the quality of governance in Western Australia. This is a further plank into the Premier's platform of centralising power. Councillors without ties to the traditional party groups are far better placed to act for the benefit of their local constituency. Imagine the levels of party funding that will pour into local government election campaigns. What chance will well-intentioned, independent, community-based candidates have up against the party political machines? What will be the cost to our community of mounting such a third round of party political campaigns? Recommendations 4, 14 and 29 of the Robson report refer to the scrapping of the present long-established coordinating body, the West Australian Local Government Association, or WALGA. This body, which all councils have dealt with for many years, is to be replaced with a new commission. What will be the responsibility and functions of the new body? To whom will it report? And what will it cost to wind up the existing WALGA, pay out redundant staff and find new staff and officers? Certainly Robson report doesn't tell us. And how much will this new entity cost to run? Who knows? Nobody has considered those questions. This is another of the Robson recommendations we're being asked to accept on blind faith. Recommendation 11 deals with the winding up of existing regional local governments. Once again, one might ask, at what cost? Recommendation 12 of the Robson report is transferring oversight responsibility for developments at Perth's airports, major hospitals and universities to the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, as you heard Mayor Norris mention. It is not at all clear how such a regime could apply to airports, for example, as these are owned by the federal government. However, airports, hospitals and universities require infrastructure and services such as access roads, footpaths, rubbish removal and building and planning services, which all cost. Under the existing regime, none of these instrumentalities are ratepayers. Under the Robson proposals, not only will these entities continue to not pay rates, but they'll be able to do as they please without having to fit in with their local communities and without reference to their local councils. Consider, from that scenario, the parking chaos, for instance, around QE2 Medical Centre as a consequence, or the rezoning and development implications of UWA's vision of a university city. Recommendation 15A of the report proposes to extend the Super Council's boundaries to the middle of the Canning and Swan Rivers. This will thrust a whole new set of responsibilities and costs onto some local governments, including here in the Western Suburbs. Responsibility for the health and welfare of the Swan and Canning Rivers should continue to be the responsibility of the state government, particularly as approximately only 40% of suggested new local government areas would be expected to bear the additional costs of maintaining these river systems. The remaining 60% are nowhere near the river systems. Recommendation 22 of the report suggests that a full review of current legislation be conducted to address the issue of property franchise and the most appropriate voting system. The panel considers that first past the post is inappropriate for the larger districts that it is recommended. Well, first past the post voting decisions are contrary to the provisions applicable to both the federal and state elections. Why would local government elections apply different criteria for assessment of a majority decision than is the case for state and federal elections? That could only lead to widespread confusion amongst the voting public. Recommendation 26 of the report provides that if the decision is reached to proceed with structural reforms, the process of implementation should begin without delay. If these wide and very far-reaching recommendations are to be introduced, then they should be clearly spelled out to the community before the next state election, together with a full cost-benefit analysis. And before proceeding with these radical and far-reaching proposals, there must be informed debate and a clear mandate from the WA community. To defer all this until after the state election will be an act of deception that the people of Western Australia will never forgive. The final recommendation of the report, recommendation 30, suggests that the panel's recommendations should be considered as a complete reform package and be implemented in their entirety. Robson makes 30 separate recommendations, some of which may appear reasonable, whilst others have far-reaching consequences and uncertain outcomes. To suggest an all or nothing approach without holding a public plebiscite on the matter is an unreasonable and high-handed approach. As a former national president of CPA Australia, I'm well versed in the regime of costs and cost benefits. I would have liked to be able to stand up here and tell you what these are in the Robson report. However, as I've explained, there are simply no financial data in this report, and there is no way of calculating costs, savings and efficiencies without a much more intense examination of the effect of each of the recommendations within the report. No one, Premier Barnett, Minister Castrilli or Professor Robson included, has yet spelled out these details or told us where these much vaunted savings are coming from. Not only is there no cost data included in the panel report, but neither is there any attempt to measure the impact of proposed changes against what we have now. Interesting to note that this push to convince all of us that bigger is better and more efficient, we now know that the only West Australian councils to be investigated for inefficiencies and corruption are our three largest councils, being Joondalup, Stirling and now Canning. If amalgamated councils are so efficient and cost effective, why are those who have been through the exercise on the East Coast at a cost of nearly $200 million now scrambling to de-amalgamate? And why leave the final answer on amalgamation until after the March 2013 election? The first of the three great untruths is being thrust upon us. Mate, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our second last speaker for the evening is the Hon. Lynn McLaren. Lynn is the first-time speaker. She wasn't available to speak at Cottesloe, but we're happy to welcome Lynn this evening. Lynn, MLC, joined the Western Australian Parliament on the 22nd of May 2009 as a Greens WA elected member of the Legislative Council. She represents people in the South Metropolitan region, which stretches south of the Swan River from Victoria Park to Singleton. Lynn supports a community-driven approach to land use planning. She understands that coastal development and transport infrastructure are major challenges in our region. Lynn has introduced a major piece of legislation, the Climate Change Readiness, Coastal Planning and Protection Bill 2012, to implement planning principles that prepare for the impacts of climate change throughout Western Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, the Hon. Lynn McLaren.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's good to see that we've got a good crowd. I'd like to first acknowledge the Aboriginal people on whose land we meet. and pay my respects to their elders. I also want to acknowledge the mayors, Mayor Henderson, Mayor Hipkins, Mayor Norris, and former Mayor Higgins. I'm really delighted that the Western Suburbs Alliance has organized itself in this way to fight back. I have really been struggling in the upper house to make the point that the reform agenda that the Barnett government has set itself on is widely unsupported. And it really does take a community movement like this to convince our elected members that A, it matters, and B, there's something that we can do about it. So I commend you for your efforts. And I wanted to begin by talking about a little bit about what is possible, because sometimes when we focus on the problem, we forget what it is we're trying to achieve. I bring a perspective that is quite multidisciplined, as you can see from the portfolios that I carry. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to heritage and housing and transport, which are all intricately related to planning and community governance. And it's that view that the Greens bring into the Parliament, that everything matters, that it's very important that we integrate these decisions, that the Barnett government is repeatedly ignoring. So when you're looking at what it is we want to achieve, we definitely want community-driven planning. It's not something new, it's something that has worked throughout the ages. And in reviewing planning reform for tonight's report, I found a delightful paper from 2007 from a well-known planner and person who used to work within DPI at that time, the Department of Planning and Infrastructure. And I just want to provide this quote to you because it will hopefully put into perspective what it is that this government's doing. The Public Sector Management Act 1994 states that the public sector is to be administered in a manner which emphasizes the importance of service to the community. Yet, state government has set up bodies like Land Corps, East Perth, and Subiaco redevelopment authorities, which operate outside our democratic system and against whom many communities have complaints regarding arrogance, disregarded broken contracts, and lack of respect and consideration of community issues. And the woman goes on to say, there is no easy answer to planning for our future. The existing and proposed heavy-handed approaches with draconian powers given to as few is not the answer. We need to develop systems and processes that respond to local situations with local people. And many of you might know that's Juliet Albany. So it's not new, and it's a course of action that she was talking about things that happened in 2002, and then at that time we had a Gallup government. So the course of action is not new, and it has been pursued by both major parties in this state, and in fact, as we've noted, around Australia. What the question that we're trying to address is the planning system failing? Why is it that we are seeking to reform it? I might go forward. And actually, I forgot to point before, so I'll let you read some. So why is it that we're trying to reform it? And if you do look at what we've tried to do in the past, you could easily judge our system and say that it hasn't worked. We don't have a diversity of housing. We are struggling with affordability issues. We don't have enough small houses for our single-person households. We don't have enough big houses for big migrant families. We haven't been able to limit urban sprawl with our current system. We haven't been able to ensure that our food-growing areas are protected from urban development. And we haven't been able to prepare adequately for climate change impacts or protect our biodiversity. So when the idea of planning reform was suggested, it is tempting. However, at each stage of the legislation that they put through several planning reform bills. Never have we been able to secure these principles and goals in the legislation. So it would be great to have a planning system that would ensure that you can deliver public transport without using up all your green space. But unfortunately, these systems aren't doing that. And Directions 2031, for example, came out without a public transport strategy, which was delivered 2 years later, which still is a draft one. It hasn't got a green network, which it did have a sentence about a green network, but we haven't seen what that looks like. It hasn't explained how we can meet density targets, and you can see that there are several other issues with Directions 2031, and as it gets beyond 2031, we recognize that there are significant problems with it. One of the main challenges that the Greens see, and one of the failings of this reform system, is they haven't been able to develop what is really important, which is preparing for the huge changes that are occurring, whether we like it or not, or whether they're human-induced or not. We need to prepare for climate change, and other planning systems around Australia have done this. And I'll just briefly mention that this is where we'd like to see the planning focus. How are we going to cope with protecting our foreshore and our river from the inundation that's occurring? And how are we going to prepare for the erosion events that are occurring? And where's that money coming from? And how are our councils going to work together to ensure that we can protect our environment and our urban infrastructure? These are the debates we need to be having. The other most important debate that's happening around the city is protection of our urban landscape. And our urban landscape includes trees. And for some reason, we've neglected to put in place planning mechanisms that can protect these really important aspects of our city. People live in Perth because it's a beautiful place to live, because it's got, native birds, because it's got some shade, because it's near the river, and we have valued the amenity of the environment, and that is why we've chosen to live here. And yet our planning system doesn't adequately protect it. And we've seen time after time urban bushland and urban trees, even if it's not bushland, wrecked by our current system and its failure. So if you'd said to me, do we want planning reform? I would say emphatically yes. But that planning reform should be based on our value systems as a community. And in order to do that, we really do need to ensure that communities have a voice in that. Because it's our home, it's our place where we live. It's not just a place where developers can make profit. So that is what's lacking, and that is the fundamental problem with the planning reforms that are before us. I'm just going to briefly touch on development assessment panels. I know that the next speaker will go into them in more detail. But in the development assessment panel legislation, and the debate said that the meetings would be public, and we recently have had a review of it. Yes, are they meeting this criteria? They also promised a website and regular performance reviews and reporting. And all this was in the second reading debate, so it's certainly failed on those aspects. They also said you could make oral submissions, and they said that local government would have its normal consultation processes, and then it would go up to the development assessment panel. So fail, time and time again. And this is only 2 years ago that they passed this legislation, so brand new, and it's already failing. One of the other aspects of the reform is the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority. And this is something that I think I had the council for a week on this one bill. And we had 80 amendments to try and pull it back into line. And the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, as you know, its biggest project to date is the Esplanade, turning it into buildings. And here, they have completely failed to protect heritage values. They've completely failed to protect those significant trees of the Moreton Bay Feats that were there. They have completely failed in the river impacts, because I think I was the only person who appealed the EPA's choice not to assess this proposal. And I said, surely there's some science about dolphins and about the river health that needs to be looked at. And because the MRA is such a power unto itself, it is charged with managing all of these impacts without all of the systems that we built up over time, which have proven to at least provide some scrutiny of these planning decisions. And that's why I said, let's at least have the EPA look at this. Let's at least have the Heritage Council view on this. And we've seen with the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority that those few individuals that Juliet Albany identified way back in 04 or 07 have been charged with making these decisions without transparency and without accountability. Now I'm just going to briefly touch on the review findings. The DAPs have, and I've only just had a copy of it a couple of days ago. Thanks very much for someone who had sent that to me. And I will be spending the next few days having a look at it. But the sad fact is that Parliament only has 3 more days sitting. So this review of the DAPs comes out at a very good time. In fact, the lower house has already risen. And the review of the DAPs is quite revealing, because as we guessed, the review has found that the views and concerns of the community aren't appropriately represented and taken into consideration. And this is what the recommendations were. The recommendations are to lift the threshold from 3 million to 7 million. Now, I just want to touch on this because when the DAPS legislation was introduced into the Parliament, it went through several amendments. It actually was presented as a sort of an unfinished piece of work. And we were able to amend it, and I commended the government for doing that as we went along, but it's like we were doing their work for them. But one thing they did do was lift the threshold to 3 and 7, but it's still too low. And so I agree with the Western Suburbs Alliance that this is something that we need to amend. Also, it's recommending that DAPs can be optional, so you don't have to go to a DAP. If you choose, you can choose to go to a local council for your decision making. It's also said that only those projects which are of state or regional significance would go to DAPs. Well, even in this case, I fear that they will not adequately take into account community views. And a fine example of this is up in the Kimberley, where the Browns Basin has been subject to a development assessment now. And the local community is not very happy about the decision that they're making. Also, multi-local governments. So if there's 2 or more local governments involved in a proposal, that would go to a DAP. But if it was in a single local government, they could just manage that. And finally, that approval from the WAPC and local government, if that's required in the proposal, then it would go to a DAP. So you can see here that even WALGA is trying to wind it back a bit. These decisions have not been made by WALGA, but they're going before the local governments for their consideration. This is not the end. The planning reform system has been resoundingly criticized, and yet, as many speakers before me have said, there is absolutely no acknowledgement of this on the part of our leaders. And that is where we stand in facing a state election. That in spite of all the evidence that these were unnecessary, and I'm going to leave you with a quote from the city of Fremantle, which they were among the 177 submissions opposing DAPs. Good on you for making 177 submissions. And the report which looked into those submissions made great Hansard. We've got a lot of it on Hansard, and I quoted as many local governments as I could to try and prove that they had no support. But amongst that, in the review report, John Day's report said, oh, they're widely accepted, they're widely supported. You remember that? It was, and the facts were 44% to 55%, and it was 55% opposed. And he still said they're widely supported. And then 84% of local governments opposed it. 84% of the submissions opposing it were local governments. That is not support. And so what we have is a spin-doctoring government. And it takes a wide number of people from every walk of life to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes. We have got to. We have got to do that because they are getting away with this on a daily basis in the lower and the upper house. And so this is why I'm delighted to be here and to share your pain, and also to say that we will not give up. We will provide a voice. If the Greens have always stood up to these what shall we call them? To these proposals, we'll just say, and we will continue to do that. And I would flag that the local government amalgamations are a real concern, because the latest rumor is that they will potentially be implemented before the next local government elections. And that means that when this time of next year, in October next year, when we're supposed to go to the polls and choose our local governments, we won't be able to, because there'll be commissioners in place until they can put in the new boundaries. And as every speaker before me has said, this is without you voicing your opinions. This is not a democracy. This is not what we signed up for. And we really do have to let them know at the next state election that it is just not on. And I'm going to finish with the City of Fremantle, which said, and the introduction of development assessment panels would be a disproportionate response to actual or perceived shortcomings in planning decision-making processes in a minority of local government areas or number of applications. Many local governments, including the City of Fremantle, already operate sustainable, accountable, transparent, and timely application approval processes. And I look forward to the day when we can have them secured, and we know that those processes are the ones that we can use to create the city that we want to live in, and so that we won't be subjected to these unaccountable panels of people. Thank you.
Our last speaker this evening is Councillor Julie Matheson. Councillor Matheson was elected to represent the East Ward of the City of Subiaco in October 2011. Her campaign was built around saving Subiaco's identity, retaining the village lifestyle, promoting suitable development, and retaining Subiaco's independence. The East Ward of Subiaco has had 6 DAP applications lodged with the city since July 2011, and her presentation is a brief overview of the experience so far.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Go, Julie.
Thank you. So yes, I got the message last presentation that I went over time. So this is part 2 of a 4-part presentation. You're going to come back and have another meeting for the rest of it. So as you can see, that's my topic for this evening in the 10-minute time frame that I have is DAP, SAT and secrecy. It's a state government initiative. So DAP is the Development Assessment Panel, SAT is the State Administrative Tribunal, and secrecy is the secret meetings they have been allowed to have over matters dealing with this city. Next slide. So, as we've heard tonight, local government, why should we care? You know, why should we just let the state government, you know, ram through the legislation, force amalgamation? And it was pointed out at the Cottesloe meeting that by one of the members of the audience that none of our presentations touched on amenity So tonight I'm going to touch on amenity. And that audience was a well-informed audience, as the one is here tonight. So I look forward to your questions and your comments about the presentations that you've seen tonight. You know, local government is open, transparent, accountable for its decisions, and the local government is the caretaker of our town planning scheme. Without our town planning scheme, we wouldn't have the amenity that we treasure here in the western suburbs, and in fact all over Western Australia, both in the northern parts and in the southern parts. And the amenity is fantastic because of the local government that we have. We may have some people, in the Cottesloe area. As we know, the amenity is the key to the future, and the future is uncertain under this government at Cottesloe. We are losing control of our future, and we want it back. And we have no idea. The next point on the slide. We have no idea what the future brings. And it could look like this in Dalkeith. We've moved on a couple of slides. We've got to Dalkeith. Dalkeith and Warrantar Avenue. Thank you. No, it's fine. We'll stick with Dalkeith. The state government is intervening in the area of Dalkeith at Warrantar Avenue. The minister hasn't liked what he's seen from the local council and the elected members and the community, so he's stepping in, to create its future for Dalkeith. Next slide, which is Subiaco. So Subiaco, the state government for plans for us, is the futuristic strategies which are undermining our culture, and the developers are seizing on the opportunity. All of their submissions and their development applications talk about the state government's futuristic plans, and gives us futuristic buildings to match those futuristic plans. But I'm not sure whether that is what we want in our city. Our next slide shows our heritage. The DAP is ignoring our heritage in Catherine Street and the character. The DAP approved offices with no residential component whatsoever, and it didn't even consider the relevant size or scale of Catherine Street when it approved this development. Next slide, please. So where is the open and transparent and accountable government and decision making? What the public saw was on the left-hand side, and what was approved in secret, after secret meetings with the developer, was the right-hand side, the office building in a residential area on Catherine Street. Next slide, please. Just the points and not the picture just yet. The state government is ignoring what we want, which is orderly and proper planning. We do not, certainly when I was campaigning, we did not want any more West Perth offices in Subiaco, in the East Ward. Our town planning scheme promotes the retention of heritage character, original development patterns, scale consistent with existing developments in the locality, and the preservation of amenity, character and scale. These all come from our town planning scheme, which the local government is the caretaker of, and we as your elected members are here to enforce that. But with the DAP acting in secret, this is what the DAP have approved on the corner of Railway Road and Bagot Road. This office block, no residential component whatsoever, ignores our city's resolution on the 20th of December 2011 to zone this area R80, residential R80. The state government have ignored our plans, our resolution, and have ignored the fact, the next slide please, that this site is reserved land for public use hospital. The state government should be protecting that. The state government also should produce a current report, a responsible authority report, which should be scrutinised by the public. And these reports are not being scrutinised by the public. The DAP must publish a notice and an agenda for a meeting. It did not do that on this particular site. And it also, the DAP regulations say that any meeting of the DAP must be held in public and a copy of the minutes be published. None of this occurred. So the next point. So what the government has enabled is for the developer, and this is any place and any site around the state, allows the developer to file an ambit claim. Here, we're going to build this, what do you think? It'll get knocked back if the community have its way, and the DAP did knock back the office building in the first instance. So then the developer files a SAT proceeding. At the SAT, it insists on secrecy, and then it asks the SAT, which is the State Administrative Tribunal, to refer it back to the DAP under Section 31, and which enables secrecy, but it actually is silent on secrecy. And I challenge that, and I will be challenging that for my elected members' motion tomorrow night. They also then get the DAP to approve the development in secret and without publishing any minutes on what they determined, how they determined it, and what town planning scheme issues did they make their judgment on. This is what we are faced with the DAP. The DAP has failed us, has failed all of us with allowing secrecy to reign, especially on this site at the corner of Bagot Road and Railway Road. And it had failed the residents of Catherine Street when it produced one set of drawings and plans about what was going to be developed, and then in a secret meeting worked it out with the developer what else they could have there, and then just ignored all of the submissions from the residents and their representatives and approved an office block. So just on to the next slide. So what we're facing potentially here in Subiaco is a list of sites that could be potentially approved in secret. You may think you can write a submission or think you can have some input into it. Yes, sure, you might be able to do that. But at the end of the day, this SAT and DAP system has allowed secrecy. I believe it's rotten to the core. It should be dissolved, in my opinion. And these sites, which include Coles, the Subiaco Oval site, 208 Bagot Road, which is before the DAP at the moment. You have until the 14th of December to make your feelings felt about those particular developments. That's at Hay Street and Olive Street. There's also the Pavilion Market site, which is a developer could get the minister to intervene, and he's already tried to intervene by asking us why we won't approve 14 stories or 16 stories on the site. So we are under siege. Our sites are under siege. The foreshore at Cottesloe is potentially under siege if their town planning scheme gets approved and then the developers work out how to use the DAP-SAP system. And so that leads me to my final slide, and I hope Colin and I'm on time now at the 10 minutes. Tomorrow night I will be putting to Council the question of Supreme Court action over the procedural process for the DAP system. So now at the moment I'm curious as to was the DAP properly constituted when it had a secret meeting? If it wasn't, does the decision have any legal effect? And also, can the DAP minutes to approve the development application remain in secret indefinitely? So that matter is before council. It's currently a confidential item, but I will be moving a motion to have that matter heard in public if I can get the support of the community, because we are under siege in Subiaco with potential secret developments, and we've already got one. And I thank you all for coming tonight, and do vote for Independence Day on the 9th of March 2013.
Speakers, they would please come to the platform, please. We're now going to have question and answer time, and whilst I'm inviting the people to come to sit on the stage here, I'll introduce Wayne Marks. Wayne, you're coming up for the question and answer time. Wayne, as you probably know, ladies and gentlemen, is the independent candidate for Churchlands, and I'll just briefly tell you, his working life commenced in the exploration and mining industry, doing geology. He subsequently took up his interest in finance and commerce, completing a Bachelor of Business degree and still later undertaking a graduate diploma in human resource management. He is a fellow CPA and spent 20 years with Western Mining Corporation Resources in the Eastern Goldfields, Adelaide and Melbourne. In recent years, he has devoted considerable energy to environmental and conservation activities in the Western region of Perth. He is currently the chairman of the Western Region Environmental Network. Now, we've got some microphones here that can be passed around the audience. Mel, you're here. Who's going to hand these round?
Richard.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'd love to have your questions. As I said, we would like to finish at 9:30. That gives us 25 minutes of question times. If we finish before that, we can go home early. Are there any questions from the audience? I hope you haven't been bamboozled, but as you can see, these speakers know what they're talking about, and there is a lot to learn. Are there any questions? One at the back.
Panel, I'll first make a comment. I'm just so grateful that I'm not an Egyptian citizen living in Cairo, where an undemocratic and dictatorial leader has taken away all the people's rights with no appeal to the judges. But I draw no comparison between that situation in Egypt and anything in Australia. Now, my question is, you've mentioned a number of times about corruption. Before I came, I had a quick look through the Australian Crime Commission 2011 report on organised crime in Australia. Has anyone looked at the influence of organised crime in any of the corruption cases that we've seen in the larger councils? One of the areas that it's most prevalent is in waste collection. We have a great waste collection system developed by a previous town clerk of Subiaco. The private waste collectors in Europe are suffering because they're not getting a return on capital employed. So, do you think there is a possibility with larger councils, the opportunistic organised crime will see the vulnerabilities and try and get in and get their cut? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that question quickly? Right.
The simple answer is the simple answer is, of course, the simple answer is yes. As someone has mentioned earlier tonight, the moment that you have larger municipalities, greater number of people, you have fewer accountability or fewer opportunities for accountability and transparency from elected members, and more delegated authority to council, to officers. And the moment you have delegated authority to officers, then you allow the way clear for decisions to be made by officers that may or may not be accountable. You may or may not discover them until after they happen. And so it's a high probability that the further you get from the ability of elected members to monitor what officers are doing, that mischief will occur. So no surprise at all, and the answer is yes.
Yeah, the City of Stirling, they had a Triple C investigation in early last year before. I live in the City of Stirling, and I went to quite a number of council meetings and had some media press about the City of Stirling's corruption and the process and lack of, and the delegated authorities or lack of them. And in fact, the accounting procedures and processes that run within the city. So they have made some significant changes, but that's a classic example just within the local area from where we are that you've had largest council in metro area where you've had recent corruption practices.
Another question, please. Just before we go on, Richard, there was actually a very good DVD made by one of the film producers regarding the Leichhardt Council in New South Wales. There was so much corruption in New South Wales Leichhardt Council that the movie was called Rats in the Ranks. It's mind-boggling when you watch it.
Hello, my name's Elizabeth Ree. I'd just like to say I think all the speakers were really great, and I think people need to be more informed of actually what's going on, so I totally support everything everyone said today. With the DAPs, are you aware that in New South Wales that they are really pushing to overturn them because they've seen what's happened in there, and there's a big report out that actually could be used parliamentary-wise. My question is for Lynn, if you don't mind. With regard to SAT, which I could write a book about all the things I think are wrong with SAT, the problem is with SAT, is anybody raised the issue in government that they actually, about the members on the SAT panel? We talked, the comment made earlier, for those that don't know, that DAP is made out of so-called experts and also councillors, and of course councillors are selected by factions, so not necessarily at all in the support of the community. But the SAT members, I find, are questionable, for want of a good adjective, that whether or not you could raise in Parliament how the people are elected on SAT, and whether or not you can find some of their names, but it's very questionable the SAT members that actually hear some of the decisions, and the decisions that are made are not consistent at all, but are more motivated, in my opinion, by political gain and power tripping, and very much aligned with planners. So I don't think I've seen it, and if it has, if you could point it to my direction, but if it hasn't, I'd be really good if you could raise the issue about the SAT members, because I think if we're going to look at decision makers, whether they're elected members on our local council, which we should support totally, questionable those on DAPs, but definitely questionable on SAT.
So your question is?
The members on SAT to be investigated, the people that sit on SAT, the decision makers.
Are you addressing your question to any particular?
To Lynn, the Honourable Lynn McLaren.
Briefly.
I'll take that question. Thank you very much. I was elected about 3.5 years ago, and one of the most comprehensive reviews of the State Appeals Tribunal was tabled at that time and debated. And there is such a wealth of knowledge in that report. It's one of the most substantial reports I've done. It's about that big. And I would commend that to you. Of course, this government has entirely backpedaled and ignored every recommendation in that report, but that report does say how SAT is functioning, how it can be improved, and you're right on the money in saying that they are not democratic, and that was when they were introduced. I was working for a member of parliament, and that's exactly what we said. We said, there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of accountability, and it is this devolution of democratic power from the community to individuals. And one of the things that I argued heavily for in the DAPS was that the membership would be broad-based and have some sustainability criteria. We also argued the same for SAT, and I think there is one person charged with looking after the world, the environment, one person on SAT who's supposed to know something about the environment. And in the DAPS, we did argue that the quorum had to include local government people, because the way that they originally proposed, it was like a panel of 5. They could make decisions with 2 people, and neither one of them had to be a local government person. So it was pretty bad. And we did argue to improve representation, and the minister did agree.
If I could say something on this. So in my professional career, I've had quite a lot of contact with the SAT and appeared there many times. I haven't heard a lot of criticism of the members, but I have heard substantial criticism about the ethos of how they operate, and that is that they are set up to find a solution. And this encourages the ambit claim and the SAT finding a solution which is somewhere in the middle of what the developer puts up first and what the council or the DAP decide. So I think you should bear in mind what the alternative was before we had the SAT, and that was all appeals decided by the minister. Now, to my mind, and I've seen both systems operate, the SAT is by far preferable. And if you think about environmental appeals, which still are decided by the minister, I believe that it would be better for environmental appeals to be decided by the SAT. So the SAT has its problems, but I think there are other things which are worse.
Are there any more questions?
I've just started to read the Robertson report, and so it's in the beginning of the covenant section. They're talking about the.
Can you speak up? I can't hear you, please.
Okay. I'm reading the Robertson report and regarding the governance section with regards to the chief executive officers of the new regional planning groups. As I remembered the report, it was saying that the CEOs of the new councils, they are going to be somehow put under the Public Service Board in terms of remuneration, and it almost as if their appointments were going to be approved by the Public Service Board. Now that would indicate to me that the CEOs of the regional council are actually being employed by the governments and they're contracted out to the council. Am I reading the report, the recommendation correctly?
Who wishes to answer that?
I'm also chairman of the Western Metropolitan Regional Council, which the 5 member councils in the Western Suburbs are members of. One of the recommendations, I think recommendation 6 of the Robson report, is that the 5 regional councils be wound up and be replaced by, I think it's recommendation possibly 14 or so, by the state government creating a Department of Waste. And if you don't know, in the metropolitan area, the 5 regional councils collect about 1 million tonnes of waste a year. And at the present time, the vast majority of that goes to landfill. So if the government has a proposal that towards 2020 is a diversion of waste from landfill, the reality is, as we sit here right now, the government has no plan for that to be able to be achieved. And to be frank, the regional councils are pushing ahead, trying to find solutions in their own way, the 5 regional councils, trying to find ways to deal with the waste presently going to landfill. And you may or may not know that at the WMRC we're building the Dicom plant, which will divert 70% of waste from landfill through an organic process and create compost.
Now, that doesn't answer your question. That's by way of a brief commercial for the WMRC. But the point is, and the important point is, Robson's recommendation to do away with the regional councils, which represent all member councils, and to create a Department of Waste. And that is the point where you start seeing the emergence of a very large entity that, again, has none of the accountability that we have at the present time. It's rather ironic that the state government treats us like children. So under the Local Government Act, we have very limited capacity for any entrepreneurial activity, and yet we are held accountable for the cost effectiveness of what we're doing. So typical approach in regard to waste, for example, the innovation that Mr. Marmion kindly gave us about 12 months ago, e-waste, which we estimated required annual funding of about $800,000, and I think Mr. Marmion gave us $50,000. Now the problem with that initiative is that it creates the community expectation that the service will be provided, then the government withdraws the funding or fails to provide adequate funding, and then the regional councils, and more particularly the member councils, then have to fund the community expectation. So it's that classic cost transfer exercise which has been going on forever. But anyway, to answer your question, yes, it would be my understanding that if Robson was adopted that there would be a Department of Waste, and that would just be another government department that would come under the control as a government, as a public service.
Ron, you were never this verbose when you were on the Studio Council. Questions, please? If you could keep them brief, that would be helpful, and hopefully we can finish the night as I promised at 9:30.
I'm one of the bunnies from Catherine Street, and I've done a lot of reading since that event occurred on the 8th of March. And one of the things I find perplexing, I'd be interested to hear what people think, is you read so many of the legislation and the state government policy documents, and my favourite of all of them is the Freedom of Information Act, because when I read it, I feel like I live in a democracy. And I just wonder, how have we gone so far off that path into this state that we're in? And what's driving it? Why is it happening? It's not happening by accident. So who is behind this change that's occurred, and where are the vested interests? If anyone's got any theories on that, I'd be happy to hear.
Brief answer from someone.
Follow the money. Who are the major supporters of the major political parties, and who's got the most to gain? And they're the major contributors, and so they're the ones that are setting the agenda.
I have a similar answer. I do think that developers, the property industry, and particularly in planning, the property industry stands to benefit the most. And so they would definitely be behind reforms which would streamline processes to get their projects approved. But I don't necessarily think, although I haven't talked to Max about this, we should probably talk later, but I don't think it's necessarily a master plan. I think it's more likely a lack of someone paying attention. You know, I think that we have trusted government, and particularly the Australian culture, and I've been here since '83, so I think I'm beginning to understand the Australian culture. I think we trust government, and I think government is proving that we need to steer it more, and we need to pay more attention, and we need to speak out more, and those are not natural things to do, because she'll be right is a very common response. And I think if anybody has anything to be gained, then it's pretty easy to steer this government, or either government, as you've named, both of the old, we call them the old parties, we don't call them the major parties. Both of the old parties sort of suffer the same problem, that they're easily steered and they are susceptible to donations. But I think we have the power to turn it around just by waking up and by speaking up and by not letting it happen. as you saw with Barnett at that meeting the last time, when the Premier, delivered the report, you put enough pressure on him and he said, okay, here it is. And I think that generally people go into public life to try and do the right thing. And if we tell them what the right thing is and if we don't let them misbehave, then I think they'll do the right thing.
Hopefully.
They listen. I'll take one more question.
Can I just make a couple of comments? John Booth, resident.
Make it brief, please.
Yes. Firstly, I wanted to say well done to all the speakers. I think you spoke incredibly well.
Yeah.
I was very impressed with what you said. A number of us have been very concerned about the development of 263, 277 Hay Street, which is a 5-storey development that is about to be handed down. RA reports due to Subiaco Council on Wednesday, goes to DAP on the 14th of December. We're obviously very concerned about it. It breaches TPS in many different areas. I think the thing about tonight that I realise is that it's about people speaking out. There's certainly a lack of democracy, a lack of transparency through to SAT. The developers have been the ones pushing this, I believe, throughout, and it's up to us. At the end of tonight, I think it's up to all of us to go out and speak to 5 or 10 people, to speak to your neighbours, to talk to people, to let them know. Because what will happen otherwise is people will say, let's have less government. Let's say we get rid of one layer of government, and it'll be local government that'll go. Because people will say, yeah, we'll save some money, it'll be easier, we'll get better decisions. That'll be the simplistic view people will take without really looking into it. So you need to have a voice, and you need to speak. You need to talk to your neighbours, you need to get out there, and you need to be heard. And apathy will be what wins at the end of the day if you don't.
Thank you. Maybe finish question time there, but if you would bear with me, what I'd like to do is to do what we did down at Cottesloe, and I asked the audience 3 questions, and if you would be prepared to do what we did down at Cottesloe and respond with a show of hands, I would be very grateful, as indeed the speakers would be as well. So the first question is, how many of you feel that the government's centralisation of planning powers and disenfranchisement of local government is unacceptable, that the Development Assessment Panel should be terminated and the right of appeal restored and public open spaces be preserved? If you're in favour of that, would you please show your hands?
Oh, that's right.
So that looks like a unanimous vote. Thank you. The second question is, how many of you would support a statement of no confidence in the Planning Minister, John Day? That's a big rush. That's a big rush. And thirdly, how many of you would say no local government organisation without majority community support? I'm sorry, no local government reorganisation without majority local support. Thank you very much for your readiness to respond. I'd now like to call upon Mr. Colin Matcham to wind up the proceedings.
Well, thank you very much, panel members, and thank you very much, audience. It's been an extremely interesting evening. I only just want to say 1 or 2 things. First of all, I think what we realised tonight is that these concerns are above party politics. This is something of massive importance to our lives. In answer to the lady who asked who is behind all of this, it is quite interesting to see that one of the strongest lobbyists for forced amalgamation and the retention of the DAPs is in fact the Property Council of Australia, WA branch. It's interesting too, the way the language of this has changed. Because first of all, we're talking about mergers, then we were talking about amalgamation, then it became change, now it's become reform. This is a kind of George Orwellian thing going on here, because if you look up reform, it's putting right malpractice, non-operational things, abuse, corruption. Well, where's the evidence of that? Why are we even having, the Robson report? The last message I'd like to put to you tonight is this. Please, if you've been moved by what you've heard tonight, join the Western Suburbs Alliance, give us your support the independent candidates, tell your friends all about these issues, and please let us know what else we can do. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and before you go, would you please put your hands together for the speakers who delivered their addresses tonight?